is on continuous delivery with Amazon ECS and Jenkins. Our panel members today, if we can go on, is Tracy Kennedy. Tracy is product manager at CloudBees, and she owns the CloudBees network. That's going to be an interesting story, Tracy. And then secondly, actually one of my favorite webinar presenters is Cyril. Cyril is a direct. Thank you, Cyril. He's Director of Product Management at CloudBees, in charge of Enterprise Edition. And Cyril, just, if you're technical and you've got questions about Jenkins, integrations, and so forth, I couldn't think of a better person in the world to ask. So Cyril, welcome. Tracy, welcome.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. And with that, let's turn things over to Tracy.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Alan, and thank you all for attending today. As Alan already said, this is a presentation on continuous delivery with ECS, Amazon ECS, and Jenkins. I am going to go into some of the concepts at the beginning just as a refresher for anyone who's not familiar with what continuous delivery is, what Amazon Web Services is, and then also with Jenkins and CloudBees. But I do presuppose that there are some, that you have some knowledge of at least what Docker is. But I will go, if you are lost, if you get confused, please feel free to ask Cyril in the chat. As Alan said, Cyril is an expert at all of these topics, and he'd be more than happy to help you guys so that you can follow along. Also, after the presentation, we will be socializing the slides with you guys. And if you stick around to the end, there will be a code at the end to give you 20% off to attend the Jenkins user conference this year called Jenkins World in Santa Clara. But let me go ahead and begin. So just as a refresher for everyone on the call, we're again going to go through some of the concepts that we're going to go into some depth in during this webinar. So what is continuous delivery? It's pretty straightforward. It's the concept of having your software always in a deliverable state. Every commit should keep the code from failing during tests and things like that, and that this requires some degree of automation of your entire software development lifecycle, as well as a really good feedback loop. And of course, Jenkins is the #1 CI/CD server in the world for this today. This is largely because of the wonderful community around the tool. There are over 1,200 different plugins which provide a lot of features and integrations with other great DevOps tools. And yeah, it's the market share that Jenkins has is just completely unparalleled. We're talking like 80%. And then of course, when it comes, which is the company that Cyril and I work for, CloudBees is basically producing enterprise products around Jenkins itself. So enterprise focused plugins and toolings for managing Jenkins at scale, as well as deploying Jenkins as a shared service across an entire organization. And then of course, Amazon Elastic Container Service, which was the main focus of this presentation today. That is Amazon's Docker container orchestration tool. It's based on, it lives within Amazon Web Services, and it uses the existing Amazon EC2 instances to deploy those containers. We'll go into that in some detail, but it provides features like health checking, it automatically restarting containers that die based on how many you desire to have running at a given time. You can also define different services and things like that, and clusters of containers. And again, we'll go into this in some more detail. This is just a very beginner-friendly introduction to what this is. And then, of course, today we'll be going into how to use Docker with Jenkins. And there are many ways, some ways which we won't go into today. But the gist of today will be focused on building a Docker container, putting your application in the container, using Amazon ECS to deploy that container to the ECS environment on an EC2 server, and then of course the whole time per continuous delivery we are getting feedback at every stage of the cycle, and then outputting that in a really visually friendly way for the user. Other options as well, we won't go into this today, other options though for using containers and container management. There's other tools besides ECS. You may have heard of Kubernetes, you may have heard of Mesos, and there are solutions already out there around both using Jenkins with ECS for managing the architecture, with Kubernetes and Mesos for managing the architecture and things like that. But we also have our own version at CloudBees called CloudBees Jenkins Platform Private SaaS Edition. Again, I won't go into that today. We've had some webinars about it in the past though, but it's basically a way to create a shared service of Jenkins that you can distribute to all of your organizations while having like a centralized management dashboard for controlling all those masters and allowing for turnkey provisioning of all those masters. But again, back to today's topic. Today we're going to show an actual real-life deployment of Amazon onto Amazon Container Service using Docker containers, and of course Jenkins is pivotal to this. It's orchestrating the entire pipeline. So the flow is basically, I'm sorry, was that a question? I heard somebody start talking. No, okay, all right. So basically the flow though is that we're going to have Jenkins orchestrate from beginning to end of the cycle using something called a Jenkins file, which is a definition of the flow that you would like Jenkins to perform. So what types of tasks, what order, what kind of logic, should I do this if I get this build result back or this test result back, who should I notify, etc. And this Jenkins file is lives in the source code, lives in the root directory of your source code repository. And I'll again show all this later. This is just a brief introduction. But anyways, the target flow then is anytime code is changed, in this case we're using GitHub, that should notify Jenkins. Jenkins should pull this source code, build the project, run tests against the project. If everything passes, package the output, the artifact, in this case it's a WAR file, into a Docker container, and then push that Docker container to Docker Hub. After all that, we're going to want to deploy. There's a manual gate at this stage, but we're going to want to deploy that newly built container to a staging server, and then we ask for input. Does the staging server look okay? Was this deployed successfully? If so, then we give Jenkins the okay, and Jenkins deploys, triggers ECS to deploy to production. And actually these two stages happen both on ECS. Jenkins just communicating with Amazon ECS to perform that. And of course we're deprovisioning the old container. So before we get into how to actually set something like this up, I'm going to introduce you to a little bit of ECS terminology. It's fairly straightforward, but the idea is that there are several different concepts in ECS. One is a cluster, which is exactly what you'd expect it to be. It's a group of containers in a particular AWS region. So if you've used Amazon Web Services before, you should be familiar. There are certain regions like US East, US West, California, etc. And so that clusters are limited to a given AWS region. And you can of course have cross-region clusters. Tasks are within something that live within clusters. They are definitions of what type of container you want to pull, and from whatever your container registry is. In this case I'm using Docker Hub. You can use a private registry, but tasks define what container you're using, where it's coming from, and any other environment variables that you'd like to set, which will override whatever settings you already have defined in the container. So if there's a different port you want to open, that's something you can define here. And then we have services. So tasks are part of a service, and services just define how many tasks or containers you would like to have running at any given time. So maybe you want to have 3, maybe 4, maybe you want it to auto scale. These are things you can set at the service level, and we'll visualize that in a couple of slides. Container agent, this is an agent on an EC2 instance that registers that instance to an ECS cluster so that the cluster knows, this server in this region is available, and I need to deploy, XYZ number of instances defined by my service, and then it will execute a task to define those containers, to deploy those containers to those EC2 instances. And Amazon is actually nice in that they provide a pre-baked EC2 image, AMI, which has an ECS agent already registered to it, so you don't have to install that. That's just a nice thing that's pre-configured for you. Then we also have container instances, which once that EC2 instance registers with a cluster, it is now called a container instance. So again, any questions, please feel free to write it in the chat. But again, this first half of the presentation is just an introduction. We're going to go into this in a little more detail with some visuals. So first visual, target deployment environment, ECS then. So basically, we're going to have a ECS cluster set up in the ECS service. And then we're going to have an EC2 instance set up in AWS EC2. And that instance is registered to the cluster. And then on that instance is a Docker host, Docker daemon that's running. And within that is the ECS agent container. And then any tasks that we've configured for this cluster and services that we've configured for this cluster, those tasks will create containers within that EC2 instance. So pretty straightforward. So we'll just go ahead and continue. Again, questions in the chat. I go into a little bit detail here because if you want to replicate what I'm showing today, I wanted it to be very clear like what my recommended settings are, at least for experimentation. This is not a guarantee for a production environment. But today I'm actually going to show you guys the most cutting edge version of CloudBees' flavor of Jenkins, CloudBees Jenkins Enterprise. It's actually unreleased, but it is built on top of Jenkins 2.0 and it will be released within a couple of weeks. But spec-wise, for my Amazon EC2 instance that I'm running my Jenkins server on, I'm just using a T2 medium, and those are the specs for it there. I'm also using Amazon Linux, so it's Amazon's flavor of basically CentOS. And then I just have the following tools installed, which is just Git. And then I also have the following credentials set up for the different services that I need to pull code from or push my container to, or EC2 for connecting my slave, which is also an EC2 instance. So these are just my recommended settings. Feel free to experiment a little. This is just what I found worked for me. And then when it comes to plugins that I use in this demo, I used a lot of the CloudBees plugins, especially the Docker plugins, which the Rails team set up and created for the community. I also use the very popular pipeline plugin, which is a new job type in Jenkins that allows users to programmatically define their entire flow of a given, for a given software development lifecycle. So you define, what types of steps should happen at a certain stage, how many steps you want to run in parallel. And then we also use, the Docker plugin, a nice visualization plugin that comes with pipeline just to see how long certain stages are taking, the Git plugin and the Docker Hub plugin. And we are using, this is a proprietary plugin to CloudBees Jenkins Enterprise. It's called the CloudBees AWS CLI plugin, and it provides like a nice way to wrap all of my AWS specific steps and pass on my credentials without me, hard coding them into the script. So it's a nice tool, and then also it allows me to trigger certain actions in AWS. So when it comes to the Jenkins Slave, agent, formerly known as a slave, this is basically just a pre-baked image that I'm using from CloudBees. CloudBees also provides a pre-baked Jenkins image, but because I wanted to use the latest version of Jenkins, the 2.7 LTS, I rolled my own, but you are, of course, welcome to use our existing images in the AWS marketplace, as well as this really well set up Jenkins agent image, which already has all the tools you need installed to replicate this demo, Docker, Maven, Git, Java 8. This is just the size machine I ran it on for this type of job. I found that it was the perfect size, and then it's using Ubuntu as the operating system. And then I connected this slave. Again, it's another EC2 instance. I connected it with an SSH connector. I gave it a label so that I can refer to it in my Jenkins pipeline, which you'll see shortly. And then these are just reminders when you're fiddling with it. If you do want to fiddle with the configuration, make sure that the Docker daemon started. Otherwise, you won't be able to actually do anything on this slave, like talk to Docker Hub or anything, because Docker won't be up. And then also make sure that your EC2 user is in the Docker group on this agent, because that will allow the Jenkins Slave agent to actually perform, again, any Docker-related functions. Otherwise, you'll get a lot of errors. So just a heads up. Okay, so then this is just an introduction then to what a Jenkins file is. It's directly related to that pipeline plugin I mentioned briefly, which is, again, a programmatic way to define the flow for a given software. So the Jenkins file is just a file with that Groovy script, and it just lives within the root of your project, wherever that project is, GitHub, Bitbucket, it doesn't matter. In my case, I'm using GitHub, and as you can see, there it is. And what it does, again, it just scripts out the target, like what types of steps you want to execute against this, your program, and then also how you want to deploy it, how many stages do you want to run in parallel for a given test and things like that. And then, of course, the way that it works is basically this. You have two options when you're configuring a job in Jenkins. You can either define the entire pipeline in Jenkins itself, or you can define it in this job and just tell Jenkins where this file is, and then just check it out with your code, and then Jenkins will recognize this is a Jenkins file and begin building your project based on whatever you've defined in that file programmatically. So Docker file, if you've used Docker before, you may already be familiar with this. I've also put my Docker file in the root of my project, and it's basically a file that defines what a given Docker container, like what needs to be in that container, what is it exactly, what operating system is it using, is it CentOS, Ubuntu, and then also what container do you want to run your application in, and ports you want to expose, etc. And so in this case, we're just using Tomcat 8, which is a predefined Docker image. And then we're using that as a base, and on top of that we are copying in the artifact we're going to build in this demo, and then we're exposing a certain port, and then when I build this Docker file, I'll get a Docker container that is running my my war. All right. And then again, I mentioned it earlier, but our target Docker registry that we want to store our newly built container with the latest version of our app is going to be Docker Hub for this demo, but there are other registries that you could use. You can use a private registry. You can use, there's a service, I believe, on Amazon that is also a registry, a container registry. Google has their own container registry, etc. It's really up to you. But again, in this case, we're just using Docker Hub. And then within that pipeline script that we're writing, we're specifying what registry we want to use with the syntax, and then we're just pushing the built Docker container to this particular registry with a label called Docker demo, just to show that that's where this particular revision of that image came from. And so in ECS, again, we went over it with pictures before, but this is more of the dirty details of how to do this. The target flow we have when it comes to ECS, so the deployment stage, the staging stage, what we're doing is from within that pipeline script, which is a Groovy DSL, we are defining, here are my Amazon AWS credentials. I would like to call the AWS CLI using that plugin, the CloudBees CLI plugin. I'd like to call the AWS CLI. I'd like to specify what service I've pre-configured in AWS what cluster, and then how many instances I would like to have up. 0 is basically the equivalent of just deprovisioning all of the running containers you have, and then 1, of course, or anything more than 1 as well, would be provisioning XYZ number of containers to ECS. It's directly related, though, to how many EC2 instances you pre-set up. So all these different containers, again, running on EC2 instances. And if you also want to do something like blue-green deployments, you would want to have an extra EC2 instance registered to your cluster that's just sitting, waiting for that failover. So back to the script, though. So all these actions are being performed within a container on our agent. I'm using a pre-configured one called CloudBees Java Build Tools, which you can find at Docker Hub. It's free to use. And then this is just the particular version of it that I wanted. It already has the AWS CLI installed, so there's not really too much for you to do there, besides adding it as calling it as part of your scripts. That's what I'm doing right here, specifying that I want to do all these steps inside of this container based on this image, and then everything else that's happening here is happening in that container on my slave agent. And then again, we're passing the AWS my credentials. We're also triggering the pre-configured task in ECS to pull the Docker image that I just built, that I just pushed to Docker Hub, and then we're deploying that to an ECS cluster. And then at the very end, there is an actual manual gate, which we'll go into. So in ECS itself, then, I have 2 clusters set up for each environment that I want. So I have a staging cluster and a production cluster, and then I just have 1 EC2 instance assigned to each. Again, you can have more than that if you want blue-green deployments, but that's just for the demo today. There's just 1 of each. And then there are tasks defined under each cluster, which we'll go into during the demo. And then each task has 1 EC2 instance assigned to it. And then, of course, there's also a concept in AWS of certain roles and permissions that you need to grant. And this is something that they've written a very good guide. AWS has written a good guide on, and is also in the comments of my notes here for the slide. But there's a certain permission you have to give to the EC2 instances for each of these, for whatever you're doing with ECS, so that those instances can actually register themselves to the ECS cluster engine. So. But we won't go into that too much. I'll just go into the demo instead of showing you slides. It's much easier to kind of grok all this if you actually see it with your own eyes. So I'll just start from Jenkins. Mute this, all right. I'll just start from Jenkins then. Again, this is CloudBees Jenkins Enterprise, the latest edition, which is not released yet, but which will be released within a couple of weeks. And here I have that pipeline job set up. And again, pipeline is a programmatic way to define the entire flow for building your job, or building your software. Sorry about that. And here I'm just showing there's 2 different runs of this particular pipeline in progress right now, and both of them are at the manual gate stage, waiting for me to confirm that the app was successfully deployed to ECS. But let's go into a little detail on the actual configuration here. And for everyone who's not familiar with pipeline, just giving an overview of what this looks like. And if you haven't tried Jenkins 2 before, you'll notice that the setup of this page is quite different. This is a feature of Jenkins 2. They introduced tabbing for different jobs. But I'll just go ahead and scroll. That's still supported as well. As you can see, a pipeline job, just like a regular Jenkins job, has a lot of the same attributes. The build triggers can basically be configured the same. Here, like I said at the very beginning, we are trying to build this whenever a change is pushed to my my project in GitHub. And then you can also configure to build your project on a schedule using cron. You can also build the project again if something changes with any image in Docker Hub that you think is important and relevant that would require you to rebuild this entire project. So maybe something changes with the Tomcat container, and maybe you want to take that change. This is one way to do that. And then, of course, it's always a good practice to discard old builds, so you're not unnecessarily wasting disk space. And then here, I'm just configuring. Here's my GitHub project. It's just a game of life demo, but we'll go into that in a second. And then within the actual pipeline configuration, again, you can either define the whole thing right here, or you can just pull from an SCM of your choosing. I'm using GitHub, and I'm just passing along my credentials. I'm telling it what branch to pull from, and then I'm also specifying, where is the pipeline actually defined, and here it's just the Jenkins file and the root of the project. So there's some flexibility there. But let me go to GitHub and show you what this actually looks like. I'm a little bit too zoomed in. Let me go to the root of the project. So again, this is based on a pre-existing demo project called the Game of Life, originally from Jenkins, the definitive guidebook. And I've just altered it for the purposes of this demo. You can go to it's public, so you can go to my GitHub project and check it out, fork it yourself and play around with it. And I also have like a little README file that describes what it's meant to do. But as you can see here, again, the Docker file, so the description of what kind of container I want to deploy this project into once it's built is right here, just for ease of finding it. And then I have my Jenkins file here, which is describing how I want to build this project. So we'll go into step-by-step what you see here. Again, this is a Groovy-based DSL, and here I'm just defining where do I want to run everything within the curly braces here. So here I want to run on my EC2 master that I've labeled, EC2 slave that I've labeled EC2. If you could also specify master if you want to run some steps on the master. It's up to you. Though of course it's not a best practice. And then here I'm just defining the name of the stage, and that's purely for visualization purposes. You can also restart from given stages if you have the CloudBees pipeline checkpoint plugin installed. But in this case, this is the beginning of the flow. There's no need for a checkpoint. Here I'm just passing credentials before I check out my code from GitHub. But this is a public project. This wasn't necessary, the credentials bit. And then also I have a stage here for testing, and here I'm just running a Maven command, Maven install, because this is a Java project that's built with Maven. Here I have a stage called build app, and I'm running Maven install again, and then I'm archiving the actual artifact that's built by this. At any given stage, if something fails for whatever reason, maybe my tests failed at this stage, then the pipeline will end. You can try restarting it, but if it failed because of a problem with actual code, there's not much to be gained by that. But if it fails because of something like Artifactory is down when you're trying to archive your artifact, then it makes sense to go ahead and retry that particular stage. So again, though, here I'm just archiving the artifact, which is going to be called gameoflife.war in the folder called target. At the next stage, I'm actually putting that war file into my Docker container. So here I have an image defined in Docker Hub already called Game of Life, and it's just, as you saw before, it's called, it's based on Tomcat, a pre-configured Tomcat image. And so what I'm doing here is I'm just putting the latest version of my app into this pre-existing image, and then down here I'm actually pushing the latest version to Docker Hub. This is where I specify where I'm pushing it to. Here are my credentials. This was just debugging just to make sure everything was okay, where it's supposed to be, and then here I'm actually doing that push along with the label Docker demo so that I know where that particular vision of that image came from. In this last stage, this is the actual ECS bits. So here I want to specify that I want to stage my image in my staging server on ECS. So I'm defining, as I said previously, I'm running all this within a container that has a pre-configured ECS agent. Again, it's called CloudView's Java Build Tools. It's in Docker Hub. It's completely free to use. And then here, now that I've specified this is the image I want, here I'm actually performing the actions inside a container that I'm running based on that image. I'm wrapping all this with my AWS credentials so that I don't run into strange errors. And then here I'm actually doing the actual work of, calling to ECS, telling ECS I want to update my existing service name, staging game, sorry. And then I have a cluster, it's in a cluster called staging, and I want to deprovision any existing containers. And then we wait until ECS reports that that's happened. And then we specify now, okay, I would like to deploy, one container that I've already pre-configured. And again, a couple seconds I'll show you what that looks like in ECS. And then we wait. And then once that's happened, we just confirm with curl, okay, there's something there. And then we echo back within the Jenkins logs. It looks like it was successfully deployed. Can you check this staging environment? If yes, give me a thumbs up, and we'll go ahead to the next stage. In the final stage, this is the actual deployment to my production server in ECS. It is exactly the same, which makes it easy. Again, we're deprovisioning anything already in production, waiting to make sure that that has happened. Then we're provisioning one more of the newly built Docker image that we just put together. It will spin up a container based on how many you define here and how many EC2 instances you have available. And then again, we're just checking, did it appear to deploy okay? Yes, okay, and we output that to the Jenkins log. There's other things you can do. Of course, you can have, again, that blue-green deployment, but this is just the most basic pipeline where we're actually able to continuously deliver new versions of this application on any changes to the actual project in GitHub. So let's go then into ECS so you can see what that looks like. Again, this is part of AWS, and there's also EC2, which is the actual their original virtualization service for just regular servers, but this is again more focused around helping you manage Docker containers. So here, this is the page for managing clusters, and again, it's a regional based thing. So it's tied to whatever. Right now, I'm using Northern Virginia as my region, but you can pick whatever is convenient for you, or have multi-region clusters. But each of these definitions is specifically associated with that region. So here again, we have our production cluster and our staging cluster. So let's go into staging. And here you can see these are my services. I've only defined one, and each service is associated with a task, which is associated with a Docker image/container. So let's just go into the service then here, which is called staging game, and as you can see, it's active. This is the revision of my task that I'm using, which is revision 9, and I wanted 1, and that's how many is running. If anything happens, so if any container dies for whatever reason, it will, because it does health checks and things like that, it will reprovision that container. If there's something wrong with that server and you have another available, same thing, it will always strive to keep the target number of containers up if there are, any resources available to do that, if there's something wrong with their EC2 instance, for example. So here, we have the service staging game within our staging cluster. And then again, here's the revision of the task that we're running, and tasks are what bring up Docker containers. And again, here we see that it's running. They have other metrics around events. So you can see things like when a container fails. You can set up alerts and things like that just as you can in EC2. And you can also see when this particular tasks run. You have the option, I didn't do it, but you have the option to turn on auto scaling as well. And then you can also see any deployment events or any ones that are pending or stuck. And then of course they have the traditional EC2 style metrics about CPU utilization, memory utilization, etc. So let's go into actual task then, since that's the meat of what's happening here. Again, the task is how you pull Docker containers or bring up Docker containers on an EC2 instance with ECS. So here, this is already pre-configured. I have one called staging, and here I've just configured, this is the name of the container that I'd like to start. Here's the image in the registry I've specified. By default, ECS plays very nicely with Docker Hub, but of course Amazon has their own container registry, or you could use Google Container Registry here. But right now it knows to pull my image from Docker Hub with a particular tag, which in this case is the Docker demo tag. And then here you can specify, anything else about the container, how many CPU units it should use, what kind of ports you want to open, etc., and any other things you want to override for this particular container when you launch it. And you can create new revisions, and I believe this is relatively new. You can also update the existing revision. That was why I had 9 revisions of this before I had to just create new ones, so that's actually a relatively new feature. And then of course you can also set up auto scaling for a particular service. In this case I did not. So let's go back then. And then of course the production cluster is actually exactly the same thing. I have one service set up called production deploy game. I have one task set up, and it's actually the same task. So I'm pulling the same exact image from Docker Hub with the same label, same settings, everything. If you're not doing that, if there's a difference between your production staging environments, in that case then it makes sense to create a new definition. But in this case, because they're both exactly the same, I'm using the same exact tasks for both clusters for both of my deployments. So as you can see, it's the exact same thing, same staging task, 9th revision, the container name, everything is the same, as well as the host ports, etc. So let's actually see what that looks like then. Let's go back to Jenkins. Don't want to change the configuration. Give it 1 second. All right, so both of these runs of this pipeline are both at the staging stage. So up until this point, Jenkins has, as we define in our Jenkins file, pulled my code from source control, run Maven install to test the code. Then we archived the artifact, the war file. We packaged it in an image called Game of Life with the tag Docker demo. We pushed that container to Docker Hub with that tag, and now ECS is trying to, we've triggered ECS to deploy the latest version of that container. So let's go ahead and look at it and confirm whether this looks okay. Put that there. Okay, yep, it was deployed successfully. As you can see, this is the Game of Life, just a basic little demo. So I'm going to tell Jenkins, yep, it looks fine. And now Jenkins is going to run the same exact steps to deploy to ECS. So actually, let me click on this view, console output. And then here, we're actually just waiting to make sure that we're able to deprovision the old container and then provision the new one to ECS. This is okay. And then it just finished. We did the curl to make sure something was deployed there. It looks right. And now we've just confirmed to the console that it has been deployed. And here's our production server. So we'll click right here. And yep, it looks like it was deployed. So fairly straightforward. Jenkins is good in that it does all the cleanup for you of any container images that you use to do the build or anything like that at the end of the run of this pipeline. So that's what this is here. Because as you recall, we're running the meaty steps, the actual ECS steps within a container, the CloudBees build agent. All right. I mean, that's really it for the demo. I hope there were questions, or maybe it was very straightforward, but that was the gist of it. Cyril, were there any questions, I guess, before I go on?
I tried my best to answer to tons of questions.
We still have tons more.
Yes.
Yeah. That's good. I'm glad people are engaged.
Please, if I answered your question, but if it was not detailed enough, ask once more. Fan out, fan in, pipeline process. Oh.
Were there any particular ones that you feel like everyone would benefit from?
Can you show where is the source code, and can you, oh, or maybe I can show where the source code is on the ECR registry is integrated. Can you make me the presenter maybe?
I don't think I've presented. Actually, I do. Okay, I'm going to make you presenter now.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm showing my screen, and you can see that I had to look at many things to answer you. So we had many questions regarding how to integrate with the Amazon Elastic Container Registry.
Cyril, excuse me, I'm not seeing your screen here right now.
Yeah.
That's just me.
I don't see it either.
Okay, people can see your screen.
There we go, perfect.
Yeah. Can you see it now?
Good. Yes, we can. Go ahead. So,
as Tracy said, she used a Game of Life demo application. It's a demo application that is used by a book called Jenkins The Definitive Guide. And we have adapted this demo to work with Jenkins File, with pipeline, and with Docker stuff. If you look on my screen, you will see that there are many branches on this GitHub repository. First, I will share with everybody this link. So it's on Jenkins Community Game of Life. And here you will see some branches such as Amazon Beanstalk, Amazon ECS Pipeline, Amazon ECS Plus, ECR Pipeline, Azure Pipeline, Cloud Foundry Pipeline, and so on. And we also have one over there, OpenShift Pipeline as well. We should clean up all the branches that are not what we want to demo. First, let's look at the Jenkins file of the ECS demo. And here you can see that we do a git push with the Groovy DSL. So we use the Docker Hub registry here, and we do a push with this Groovy DSL. Now some of you want to use the Amazon ECR registry, which is a very nice registry as well. And let me, no, it's not this one. Yeah, this is the Amazon ECR Jenkins plugin. So you can do your Docker push to the Amazon ECR registry. It's just that the credentials are slightly different when you use ECR. And here is a sample on my screen. So you do a Docker with registry where you give your ECR registry domain, your credentials that you prefix by ECR, and then you can do a Docker push. And you will find samples on our GitHub repository with this ECS plus ECR demo, where you can see here a Docker push. So my colleague Nicolas has implemented slightly differently. He used a shell step instead of the Groovy DSL to do the Docker push, but you can see that this is the same with registry step. Okay? So this was one of the frequent questions. You want to be the presenter now, Tracy?
Sure. I don't have anything else slide-wise besides, showing some resources and things that people can try out.
Yeah.
So Cyril and Tracy, if it's okay, I'd like to get the audience involved a little bit by doing our polling questions.
All right, which sounds good.
We didn't have a chance to. So let's start with the first one. And Jules, if you can throw that up there. I'd like to understand from our audience, how many of you are currently using Jenkins at your company? and it's a simple yes or no. Hopefully it won't take us too long. We'll close voting off in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's see. Wow, 94% are using Jenkins. That, well, I guess you'd expect that with this topic, but that's still pretty impressive. Let's go to our next question if we can. Jules, and our next question is, and this is actually good, if you know, is Jenkins being used for CI, CD, or both? Little tricky. I'm interested to see what the answers are here. And we'll give you just another few seconds to answer. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And looks like most of the votes are in. And you know, this is close. I didn't think it would be this close. A little over half are using it for both CI and CD, but fully 44% are using it, it looks like, just for CI. Cyril, Tracy, is that kind of jive with what you see out in the real world, or are you surprised by that?
No, I think it's a common pattern. Many people are adopting CD. So not everybody is doing CD. And when you are doing CD, many people see value in using Jenkins to do it.
Got it.
So
and do we have another polling question, Jules? I believe we did. Okay. Is Jenkins being used at a team level, so in other words, just one group, or across multiple groups? And the answers are team level, many groups within my companies, or we have a shared services team. Sort of a overlay. And if we can get your answers on that, I know it's probably a little bit of a harder question, but we'll close voting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So here over half, many groups within the company are using Jenkins. 1/4 have a shared services team, which is interesting, and then just at a single team level, slightly under 1/4. So excellent responses. I believe that was all of our polling questions. Nope, one more. Oh, the Docker question, excuse me. Are you using Docker in production environments? Yes, no, only in staging, planning to in 1 to 3 months, none of the above. What was interesting is one of the first questions I saw, Cyril, when I was answering questions early on, someone asked, what is Docker? And I haven't seen that one in a while, but you know, certainly Docker seems to be on everyone's lips. With that being said, let's close off voting here in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And here's our answers. Wow. 41% are not using it at all, so almost half, and that's the biggest chunk. About 1/4 are using it in production, and roughly almost another 1/4 plan to in 1 to 3 months. So it's about half and half there. And that's probably in line with what we see in general around Docker usage and you know, containers in general in production environments. But interesting nonetheless. Guys, if it's okay, we do have a few minutes left, and I would like to try to get a couple of other questions from the audience in. And if you don't mind, I'll grab some here and I'll throw them at you, Tracy and Cyril. And while we're doing that, Trace, if you want to put up the slide with the links and so forth so people can get an early start on that.
All right, great. Could you make me presenter? There we go. All right. So I have a few. I guess I'll go through them really quickly. One is, if you want to get started, we have all the demos of all the things we've shown today readily available on our website, cloudbees.com/getstarted. And if you haven't registered yet for our user conference, Jenkins World is next month, and this is a code that will give you 20% off any ticket. That includes training around Docker and Jenkins and pipelines. We're also going to have a hackathon there, and there's a certification exam to become certified as a Jenkins engineer.
Tracy, I'll just add on that one, I am hosting a panel there So come, if you do get to Jenkins World, please come support me in my panel hosting. And I'm also be doing video interviews. And I love to just interview people who come to Jenkins World and similar events and understand what makes them come there, what are they looking, what did they learn, what did they think. So if you are at Jenkins World and you see our little video booth set up, please stop by, say hello. And if you'd like to be interviewed, we'd love to interview you. Sorry for the quick commercial. Go ahead.
Oh, no worries at all. I was just going to leave this screen up if it's okay.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So someone wants to know, is there a role plugin available? The role plugin available won't work for them. Are there any additional plugins available from CloudBees?
Yeah, I'll leave it to Cyril since that's his product.
Okay, so we have the CloudBees role-based access control plugin, which is our primary plugin. Otherwise, you can use the open source authentication and authorization plugins. On it, what comes to my mind is the authorization matrix-based plugin or a name like this. That can be a solution.
Okay. Here's another question. Is there any way that one can pass configuration from the build config screen to the Jenkins file to set some variables before we run the pipeline?
You can use build parameters with pipeline. I think it will not be a Jenkins file, but it will be a simple job then. So I think that it could be a solution.
Okay. Here's a bit of a general question. I'd like to understand how you guys manage multiple stages. How you guys manage multiple stages configurations.
Multiple stages configuration. So here I suspect that the question is, how can I mutualize code between processes to deploy to various stages? On another part of this question is how do I stage my application first in the QA environment, then in staging, and then in production. So first you can reuse some code fragments of your pipelines between jobs, either thanks to the CloudBees templates that are available in CloudBees Jenkins platform, but not on Jenkins open source. And the other thing is an open source feature called global shared library. So maybe I can share my screen so that you will see. Oops, no, it doesn't. I'm not the presenter. Global shared library is, maybe I will share it with everybody in the chat window. So it's a solution to share code between jobs. And I think that I would have different jobs for the deployment to production and for the deployment to other environments, so that I can have specific security for the production environment. So I would separate jobs.
Great. Next question. Any built-in support for Jarrett?
Yeah, I saw this, and I think it's high on the priority list of many people, but I think it's not yet here, unfortunately.
Got it. Is there any way a pipeline build will be green even when we're still waiting on user approval for the next stage and previous stages are good?
So I suspect that this is the desire to have the equivalent of the promoted build features that exist in freestyle or Maven type jobs. And unfortunately, there is nothing like this in pipeline for the moment, but many people are looking at a way to implement the equivalent of promoted builds, which means that your build will be green, successful, unended, and you would be able to trigger additional steps on your build.
Got it. Next is How does Jenkins handle fan-out, fan-in pipeline processes for parallelism?
Sorry, I'm not sure to understand this one. Maybe it's my English.
Or it could be my French accent, Cyril. I might have messed that one up.
I saw the question and I didn't catch it, so I moved to the next one. Sorry.
Okay. We'll send that one out in writing and try to get that. Okay, how can we deploy from a staging environment to a production environment using a particular version or build number?
So here, Cloud, when it comes to a specific version number, what I like to do to deploy on production is to have a parameterized build that will take the version number, the human readable version number of your of the application that you want to deploy, and I would grab it from something like JFrog, Artifactory, and Sonata Nexus or your Maven repo. This is an approach. Otherwise, if you want to be able to re-trigger, to rerun a given job, a build of your platform that has run in the past, CloudBees has a commercial feature which is called checkpointing, which allows you to resume, to rerun a build, an older build from a place where you have defined your checkpoint, sorry. So this is a solution that can be convenient as well.
Got it. You know what, guys, we're right at the top of the hour and I need to respect people's time. We're going to call it here. We have a written record of all these questions. Tracy, Cyril will get them to you. We'll try to post answers on our DevOps page with it. But once again, Cyril, Tracy, thank you so much for an amazing webinar demo and presentation. I think you could tell from the amount of questions and the sophistication of the questions that you really hit where people had interest, and I think it was obvious. So thank you again to CloudBees for sponsoring today's webinar as well. This was recorded. It will be available on YouTube. Go to DevOps TV. We have a bunch of CloudBees webinars up there if you're interested. And you can listen to it there. Give us about 24 hours or so to get that up. But that's it for today's webinar. Cyril, Tracy, thank you again. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to CloudBees for sponsoring. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps.com, and we hope to see you at another webinar soon. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.